Hill from the Financial Times. Last year, Richard gave me the impossible task of trying to moderate 9 big brains in an hour, and this year he's upped it to 10. I'm not quite sure what he's hoping to achieve, and I also feel I have unique responsibility to try and bring the whole conference to a punctual end at 5 p.m. We're going to do that in the space of 2 half-hour sessions, each with 5 guests. So if my guests from the first Firework could take the stage to join Guillaume, who's looking a little bit lonely up here, Rahaf, Ricardo, Lisa, and Joseph, then we can get started. Now, there is bad news here, I'm afraid, which is that there are not real fireworks in this session. I'm sure that next year, if Richard has anything to do with it, there will be real fireworks at the end of the session, but they're not compatible with Baroque frescoes, it turns out. That is the only bad news. The good news is that the fireworks that we're going to let off in the next hour are fireworks that we hope are going to illuminate the path to the 2018 Drucker Forum. What I'm going to ask the panels to try and bring out here are the insights that they have gleaned from the last 2 days and to bring the sessions to a spectacular close. And I'm going to start by asking Rahaf to kick things off on the sort of broad question, really, of what you felt were the insights from the last couple of days that lead us to answer this question of how we achieve growth without leaving people behind. Nice simple one to start you off.
Just an easy question to summarize everything that we've learned. First, I just want to say how incredible it's been for the past 2 days. I know I'm not the only one. I feel my head is kind of bursting with a lot of new ideas and a lot of new information. I would say that a lot of the conversations around inclusive prosperity has made me think about whether or not we need to expand our own definition of business and its role within a much broader ecosystem. Because in fact, we're not just talking about inclusive prosperity if we're talking about those people being left behind. We're actually talking about a new form of holistic prosperity. Prosperity that extends beyond simply financial and actually looks at environmental and social impacts and other cultural impacts. So for me, I think it's going to be very interesting to see management thinkers and leaders and experts whose role it is to kind of understand how their businesses work, to expand that definition and to recognize that their businesses no longer just exist in a silo, but that they must interact with socioeconomic conditions and culture. And from the panels that I've heard today, the one takeaway that I think I'm going to really focus on in my own practice is to follow the money. And that I know we've been talking a very big game around purpose and sustainability and impact, but if that's not reflected in the business model, if that's not reflected financially on the balance sheet, then it seems to me like it's a lot of conversation. So don't tell me that you value your talent and that you want to invest in people and you're investing money in training programs, but you don't actually give any of your employees time to take and learn and digest. And don't tell me that your values are about equitable work conditions if there's still a wage disparity between the men and women working at your organization. So I think now we really need to see the money following the values, and that's something that I'll be thinking about moving forward.
If you could pass the microphone to your left, to Joe. I'm just going to point out there aren't going to be questions and answers at the end of this. There isn't time, but we are keeping an eye on Slido. So if you have specific points you want to raise, we'll try and weave them into the conversation. Joe, I was struck in your session that you talked about, I think 92% of businesses that you're looking at having fewer than 10 people. So to pick up on Rahaf's point about businesses meeting their responsibilities, how do you do that if you're a small business, a startup, or is that something that you've taken away from this that leads in that direction?
Yeah. Let me just pick up from what Rahaf has said, because it's a very, very important point, that, and this is what I picked out today, that business leaders must start thinking about social issues around them. That's absolutely critical, because you're living in an environment such as we live, where there are things like female genital mutilation, where there is a very high infant mortality rate. You cannot ignore that, because that's your future. Those are your future customers. When you're talking about female genital mutilation, it's a human right issue. It's dehumanizing. So business cannot ignore that. And therefore, I'm putting across that certainly we, as Safaricom, we have taken a lead in that. We're involved in the medical issues. We're involved in ensuring that the infant mortality is addressed. We speak and advocate against female genital mutilation and environmental issues. But to your question now, as a small business, how do you ensure that you also address issues? But we have to understand that 92% that I talked about yesterday, that employs less than 10 people, is really about survival. They just need to ensure they get their next customer. So it is a very slow growth. I'll be exaggerating here if I say that that small business is so open-minded to start thinking about society. That will come, but the responsibility rests with the top business leaders to shape the thinking, because they have an audience, a captive audience. The government will listen to them. They will not listen to that person who employs less than 10 people.
Is there a way that you think that a business like Safaricom can work with these smaller businesses? We heard a lot this morning about the collaboration, not just within businesses, but with businesses and communities.
Absolutely. And in fact, when you say that, we have a network of 150,000 M-Pesa agents across the country. They employ less than 10 people. We have dealers with network across the country. So they have a voice, they can influence within their local community. Right. We have suppliers, which you must hold to account. For instance, if they're involved in child labor, if, for instance, they're involved in corruption, they're suspected of corruption, we must speak out, and we must show that if you want to do business with us, there is a sense of responsibility that we'll expect from you.
Guillaume, passing on to the middle table here, what have you taken away from both this conversation so far and the insights that you might have gleaned from the panel?
That we have in front of us, I think, the opportunity to make some important choices, and some bold ones. And I'm going to advocate for the arrow to be tilted more strongly towards the human, and in particular the ordinary human that compose really the mass in our planet and have in them a tremendous amount of potential. Particularly the younger generations, we have tremendously invested everywhere around the world in education. We could do more, we could do better, but we have already invested in a generation that is particularly equipped with knowledge and with ideas that are full of potential. It was amazing to hear the young participants in the Drucker Challenge talk about the humanity, to talk about simplicity. I love the story of the drone and the falcon, right? So rather than making choices that are too much tilted towards the financial performance or the technological advancement, I think we have to focus on people. And the role of managers and leaders is to try to really unlock more of that potential and to create the conditions through the right experiences for people to actually feel that they can contribute, that their voice is important, and that the good that they have in them can actually be expressed in good business results as well.
Right. For those who weren't there, the drone and the falcon was Anne, one of the prize winners' idea that actually the problem of crops being pillaged by birds could be solved better with a falcon, an avian rather than a human solution, in fact, rather than a drone, however sophisticated. Ricardo, picking up, what's your main lesson?
I have three takeaways. The first one is something I heard on the first day about the quality of the growth. So it's not growth by growth, but the quality of the growth. And this made me remember one small quote of of the book *Sapiens* from Noah Harari. It's that sometimes when I see this kind of race, it looks like a race where there is no rules and there is no judgment. You just want to win. And he said that when we are breaking a wall of a prison, aiming for freedom, but in reality, we are just moving ourselves to a larger patio of a larger prison. So the future we are building today is what we call freedom for all of us or not. The second one I mentioned a couple of times, it's about inclusion. So it's something, how we can include. So we have a question here about poverty and people on poverty line. How we can include a prosperity for most. We are not talking about having an equalitarian where everything is flat, but how we can do that. Because nowadays what we see is that my daughter was asking me a couple of months ago about this, because of course for her it's always a challenge to understand why the world is so different. And I was explaining to her in the very simple analogy. It's like prosperity is a train. Inside this train, it's more and more luxury, it's more and more nice, cool things to do, but at the same time, this train goes faster and less people can get inside of it. So I think that we need to slow down this train and probably give up of some of our desires to include more people. And the last...
Sorry, Ricardo, just to interrupt there.
Okay.
So are we giving up on some of the people, or are we...
No, I'm saying, I believe. Okay, on my belief...
Slowing down to let them get on?
Yeah, slowing down to let people get in.
Okay.
Yes, definitely.
All right.
And I truly believe that we're escalating a lot, okay, despite of different thoughts. And the last, but definitely not least, is ACT. So we are today here about 400 people in this super cool place. And what will we do tomorrow? We will include other people from our neighborhood, from our work on these discussions, or we'll keep this to a very elite discussion in this panel here. So I truly believe that we need to go out tomorrow, speak, promote, share our concerns, because there is a lot of people that need and must listen to that. So in our companies, in our business, in the companies we relate, we need to make people aware of the discussions we are having here today. And we cannot keep them only exclusive to this, because this is exactly what is definitely the opposite of inclusion. That's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you. Lisa, what are you taking home from here, and what will you most remember, want to pass on to others?
It's been 2 very full days, so I'm going to think about it on the long flight home tomorrow. But first of all, I do want to give a shout out to my panel colleague Rahaf when she said following the money and thinking about what you value. One of the common conversations that I have with my clients are they have the mission, vision, value statement that say our employees are our most valued assets till there's an economic downturn.
Right.
And then things seem to change, so I'm in violent agreement with you there. So, Andrew, it was a great question. First of all, and this may seem very simple, but one of the things I value the most about this forum every year is the chance to think. And I believe we are in a very overstimulated society. We're constantly looking at emails. I have a gentleman that I was talking to. He worked for a weapons company. And I said to him, he said, we were talking about something. He said, Lisa, this seems so logical. Why didn't I think of this? And I said, how often do you get to really think? Isn't that, as a vice president, what you're supposed to be doing? He told me he gets hundreds of emails a day, and his day is booked from start to finish with meetings. So he doesn't get that. So I appreciate that. I think 2 things that struck me were the order in which the information and the topics came about. For me, some of the things that John Hagel and Hal Gregerson talked about, the importance of asking the right questions. And in a conversation with John, I had an aha moment that I realized that framing questions the right way does two things. It creates context for the person that you're talking to, and that lends itself to understanding their own experience. But it also can create a safe place for them to be candid and honest and give their thoughts. And I would dovetail with that what Thomas Waldesberg talked about with problem statements, and different ways of looking at problems. And I think those two are inextricably linked, because as you ask questions the right way, you're gathering information and can then view problems differently and potentially come up with different solutions.
Right.
So throughout the conference, I've thought about that, whether we're talking about restaurants that serve buffalo wings or the Wolverine hand, or a different way to approach, as we heard in the last session, medical problems that are computational. I was thinking very differently, and I will also say it impacted my personal interactions and some great conversations at dinners and so forth that I was able to have.
So the techniques, those techniques that you've picked up, and I think others will have picked up as well. I mean, one of the questions coming on Slido is about training. The questioner says, in the late 70s, typical worker got 17 days of training a year from its employer. Nowadays, it's down to 10 days. Does this make sense? I mean, you're involved in making sure that people understand how Scrum works, which inevitably involves a certain amount of training in how to use such techniques. I mean, how could training be adapted to help us in this inclusive prosperity goal?
Great question, and I think we need to rethink training. I think we often think about it sitting in a classroom, death by PowerPoint, and I think theory is fine in that potentially, in a two-way conversation, but I think training also needs to include the experience. So experiential training, so the theory with the what and the why, but then there has to be an emphasis on the how. And that can be done through coaching, through mentoring. So I think that having a very narrow view of training, we ought to think more about education and different ways to approach it that fit into our lifestyle. I'm a big believer in creating an opportunity for experiential training at the time the person needs it.
Right. Rahaf?
I also think that we talk a lot about needing to be, lifelong learners. That has been another theme, that we need to just be learning and evolving and expanding our expertise. But when you get down to a very practical level, how do you actually incorporate lifelong learning in someone's day-to-day responsibilities? I'll give you a very quick example that anybody can apply in their business that I'm hoping will be helpful. But we worked with a company that had about 350 employees, and one of the things that they did was they had a weekly one-on-one with their manager, and as part of this one-on-one, each employee had to keep track of one new thing that they learned every week. It wasn't set by, it wasn't the manager that set what they had to learn. It was up to them to go and learn one new thing, and they tracked that. That was a part of their performance. It was a part of how they were reviewed, and by the end of the year, they could concretely say that they had learned, 50 new things that was related to their job. So you can't say lifelong learning, and yes, we value expanding our education, but not translate that into small actionable items that can be incorporated into someone's day-to-day responsibilities and be reinforced by leadership.
Right, Guillaume, pick that up. Is that something that you can do?
I agree with both. I would
Steelcase?
add that we know through neuroscience research that we learn better when we do. And I think it's really important for us to think more and more about how, first of all, the lifelong learning becomes lifelong learning by doing, but also how in the more academical world we create more active environments where people are not just listening in an interesting presentation or in a nice environment, but that we actually get them engaged. We know that when the people are personally engaged into what's happening, they'll remember. I remember more when I do something than if someone tells me something. So I think it's sort of moving from a static activity into something that has to be baked into what a leader can do, but also what employees are expected to do is constantly learn by doing.
Yes, part of me wonders whether actually calling it training is the problem. As soon as you say training, anybody in a big company thinks, I've got to do this day of training, I can't get on with my following up my sales leads, I've got to do this. If they're doing the online one, as somebody once told me, you're told that you can do it in 10 minutes and everyone thinks that's a challenge. I'll do it in 5. So it's not really working as a way of talking about it. Joe, how does it work within businesses that you know about, out in the field with big challenges? Is training easy or difficult? Is it something that can be picked up in the field?
I think 2 points there, Andrew. First of all, when you talk training, somebody looks at the budget and say, how much is it going to cost? Who is going to be trained? And so on and so forth. Even when we talk about we want to be a learning organization, we want to encourage people to acquire new skills and so on and so forth, we find that it's much more lip service than actual training to improve your staff. So increasingly, what is going on in business is exactly what she has said. We're focusing on mentorship. We're focusing on coaching. There's quite a bit of online training. Companies are now collecting and collating materials that they put on their portal, working with universities, working with business schools to put together what is relevant for their staff and for their businesses so that they can access that information even as they continue working.
Right. I wanted to come back to something that Carlotta raised on the question and answer panel, which has been in the sort of background of all the discussions, the idea of universal basic income. And Rahaf, I wondered whether that was something that you felt could underpin some of the sort of needs to support the whole human network, including those who currently don't go to would love to go to a nice corporate training program, but is there a support network? Does that offer the opportunities?
You're just giving me all the easiest questions today.
Solve universal basic income for us
guys,
in
we're
5.
going to solve it in the next 30 seconds.
Yeah.
No. I think that the more interesting thing to me is that the conversation around universal basic income touches some fundamental attitudes and beliefs that we have about work and about our ability to fend for ourselves and people's ability to earn their own living, which is a source of pride. So when we do talk about universal basic income, while I see a lot of possibilities, I think on the one hand there's going to be a lot of psychological and emotional challenges that we need to address. And that, I think, touches on subjects like the dignity of work, on people feeling useful, on people having purpose, which you mentioned in your panel. So I think the bigger conversation needs to be is what do we as a society expect to provide for people when we talk about inclusive prosperity? And if we go to a holistic prosperity, if we are no longer obligated to provide them with a job in the traditional historical sense of the word, then we still want to provide them with a means to live. And so instead of considering potentially about what that's going to look like, whether it's UBI or something else, I think the first conversation we need to have is sorting out our own feelings and our own emotions. Because I know from my own research, when you start bringing up the concept about UBI, people often have a very emotional, strong reaction against it. They think it's like welfare, they think people aren't going to do work, they think people are going to rip off the system, and all of that is tied into decades of contemporary work culture history.
Right.
So I do believe we need to have these conversations because the reality is that the systems that have orchestrated or that have organized, the way we have worked are changing, technology is changing, and we need to figure out a way to react, and retraining people is not going to solve it, and assuming that we're going to, have enough jobs for everyone is not going to solve it. So this is the opportunity for us to decide as a society, what are the things that we want to provide and what do we define as prosperity?
Certainly, I was just about to say, if we define prosperity a bit more widely as including that meaningful work or the dignity of the human being, then that's a much wider challenge. And in the last kind of 3 or 4 minutes, I just wanted to see from each of you, Rahaf has spoken, Joe, maybe to talk a little bit about how you see perhaps a practical way in which dignity of the human can be restored either through work or through some other mechanism. Carlotta talked about the intervention of government and so on, in order to make sure that we don't leave anybody behind. And then I'll come this way along the table so everyone's forewarned.
Yeah, in an environment where I come from, I think it would be difficult for a government to provide
Yes.
resources to support each and every individual. I think the important thing is for the government to create an environment where somebody can reasonably get something to do, an opportunity to do some business to earn an income. And that means reviewing the regulatory framework, reviewing the investment framework, just making it possible for people to access those opportunities that will give them a decent income, give them dignity.
Right. Guillaume?
I think the opportunity is in giving people a chance to contribute and to be heard. And for that, we need to spend way more time thinking about the individuals instead of thinking about age groups or nationalities or profiles, which is difficult in today's world because we all get classified into a category of something. But really, I think the dignity and the value that comes from an individual feeling dignified is in getting to know the individual, not just the marketing group that he belongs to.
Right. Ricardo?
For me, I think one of the key is foster diversity, because I think diversity will allow us to see the different points of view and include more people. So this is something that I'm working very hard now on, improving diversity, gender, geographically, religious, because then we have a full picture on how we can include. Because many times we try to include people under our beliefs. Means you want to be global, but on your terms. So try to understand. And I spend a lot of time in Africa in this. Entrepreneurship, innovation in Africa is just amazing because you see the need and you see how they can contribute, and it's not just a matter of money, so you don't need to invest. Things can happen there easily.
Right, right. Lisa, what's the point at which one can provide this kind of sense of meaning in work? I mean, part of as I understand it, of the Scrum and Agile approach is to give people the autonomy, which is something that gives people a sense of doing something at work that's meaningful.
Yes, and using some of those principles and the mindset is, first of all, thinking about what does prosperity and creating value and, as Ricardo just said, diversity mean. I think one thing that we have to be very, very careful of is that we don't define it for someone. We allow them to be part of defining that. And then, the next thing is, and Guillaume said it, is giving them access, giving people a chance to try some things. And that may mean they fail, and to have a support mechanism to say, try something else and learn from it, et cetera. So I think creating that environment, but also giving the participants a voice in how they define prosperity for themselves or personal growth or how they add value is key.
That's a very good point, because I think there is a sense, isn't there, that some top-down approaches assume that prosperity can be defined in a certain way, often with money, but it may be, as Joan pointed out in her session for millennials, it may be a different set of things that give respect to the worker.
Yes, I've seen, it was, I think, 2 years ago, we had a young man on the panel that talked to, he was millennial, and he looked at the audience, he said, stop thinking you know what I need. He said, just talk to me, because a lot of these stereotypes about what millennials need, I don't agree with. Yes. And I think that's the point.
Great. Well, we've reached the end of our first firework. The vapor trail's still in the sky. We will thank our first panel. Please thank our first panel.